The evening light filtered through the tall windows of La Lumière dehors, casting amber streaks across the polished marble floors. Sophia adjusted the cuffs of her crisp white blouse as she stood near the host station. Her posture straight but not rigid, her expression calm but attentive. The restaurant hummed with the quiet anticipation that preceded service, a kind of orchestrated stillness where every waiter, every busboy, every sommelier knew their place in the choreography about to unfold. She had worked here for 3 years, long enough to understand that this was not merely a restaurant but a theater where wealth performed its rituals and where people like her were expected to be invisible stagehands. Sophia had learned early in life that invisibility was a skill. Her grandmother, who had raised her after her parents returned to their home country to care for aging relatives, had taught her that language was both armor and key. The old woman spoke 6 languages fluently, a necessity born from a life spent crossing borders, and she had passed this inheritance to Sophia not as a gift but as a tool for survival. In this dining room, where patrons spoke in hushed tones about mergers and vacations in Provence, Sophia moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who understood that her value lay in her ability to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to be present without being seen. The evening's reservations were nearly full. Sophia glanced at the seating chart and noted that table 7, positioned near the center of the dining room beneath a crystal chandelier that had supposedly once belonged to a French duchess, was reserved for a party of 2. She did not recognize the name at first, but when she mentioned it to Carla, the hostess, the younger woman's face tightened. "Marcus Aldridge," Carla said quietly, her voice carrying a warning that needed no elaboration. Sophia had heard the name before, whispered among the staff with a mixture of resignation and distaste. He was a regular, a man whose wealth afforded him certain privileges and whose demeanor reminded everyone that he knew it. When Marcus Aldridge arrived, the front door opened with a sweep of cool evening air that carried the scent of expensive cologne and self-assurance. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that fit him with the precision of custom tailoring. His dark hair silvered at the temples in a way that suggested distinction rather than age. Beside him walked a woman whose blonde hair fell in carefully styled waves, her dress a shade of ivory that seemed designed to catch light. They moved through the restaurant with the easy confidence of people accustomed to being watched, though Marcus barely acknowledged Carla's greeting as she led them to table 7. He simply nodded, a gesture so minimal it bordered on dismissal, and the woman followed his lead, offering a tight smile that did not reach her eyes. Sophia watched from her position near the service station. She had been assigned to their table, a fact she accepted with the same professional neutrality she brought to every shift. She smoothed her apron, checked that her notepad and pen were secure in her pocket, and made her way across the dining room. The ambient noise around her, the soft clinking of silverware, the murmur of conversation, the occasional laughter, seemed to recede slightly as she approached table 7. She was aware, in the way one becomes aware of shifts in temperature, that this table carried a particular weight tonight. Marcus was already studying the wine list when Sophia arrived. She greeted them with practiced courtesy, her voice clear but not overly warm, offering water and mentioning the evening's specials. The woman glanced up briefly, her expression polite but distracted, while Marcus continued to examine the menu without acknowledging Sophia's presence. She had seen this before, this particular brand of disregard that was not quite rudeness but something more insidious, a refusal to recognize her as anything more than a function. She waited, her hands folded loosely in front of her, her posture conveying neither impatience nor servility. When Marcus finally looked up, his gaze passed over her as though she were part of the decor. He asked a question about the wine selection, his tone flat, and Sophia answered with the detailed knowledge she had cultivated through months of study and tastings. He did not respond, simply returned his attention to the menu, and Sophia felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came not from anger but from the effort required to remain composed. She excused herself to give them time to decide, walking back toward the kitchen with measured steps, aware that the evening had only just begun and that something about this table felt different, charged with a tension she could not yet name. In the kitchen, the head chef was plating appetizers with swift precision, and Sophia exchanged a brief glance with him. He raised an eyebrow, a silent question, and she shook her head slightly. Not yet, the gesture said. But she could feel it already, the weight of expectation. The sense that Table 7 would demand something from her tonight that went beyond the usual script of service and discretion. She poured 2 glasses of sparkling water, arranged them on a tray, and returned to the dining room, unaware that the encounter awaiting her would shift not just her evening but the careful equilibrium she had built around her life in this place. Sophia returned to Table 7 with the water glasses balanced carefully on her tray, her steps measured and deliberate. The dining room had filled considerably in the past 20 minutes, the tables now occupied by couples leaning toward each other in intimate conversation, business associates gesturing over spreadsheets disguised as casual dinners, and families celebrating occasions that required the formality of starched linens and multiple forks. The ambient sound had risen to a comfortable murmur, punctuated occasionally by the delicate chime of crystal touching crystal. Sophia placed the water glasses before Marcus and his companion with practiced precision, then straightened, her notepad ready, her expression attentive but neutral. Marcus did not look at her immediately. He continued his conversation with the woman across from him, speaking in English about a property acquisition in the Hamptons, his voice carrying the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. The woman nodded along, her manicured fingers tracing the stem of her water glass, though Sophia noticed her attention seemed to drift occasionally toward the other tables, as if seeking confirmation that they were being observed. When Marcus finally turned his attention to Sophia, his expression shifted into something that resembled amusement, a slight upward curve of his lips that did not reach his eyes. He began speaking in French, the words flowing with fluency and deliberate speed. His accent was polished, clearly cultivated through education rather than necessity, and he employed the kind of culinary vocabulary that suggested both knowledge and intention. He ordered the seared foie gras with fig compote, emphasizing the regional preparation method, then moved to the main course, selecting the duck confit with a reduction made from a specific vintage of Armagnac. He pronounced each term with theatrical precision, occasionally glancing at his companion who responded with small, delighted laughs, as though they were sharing a private joke. The performance was clear. He was speaking a language he assumed Sophia could not understand, transforming her into a spectator to their sophistication. Sophia listened without interruption, her face betraying nothing. She had encountered this before, though never quite so elaborately staged. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that language was not merely communication but often a weapon, a tool for creating hierarchies and exclusions. Sophia had learned to navigate these moments with careful calculation, weighing the cost of silence against the risk of revelation. Tonight, something within her shifted. Perhaps it was the woman's laughter, complicit and cruel in its casual dismissal. Perhaps it was the way Marcus leaned back in his chair, waiting for her confusion. Whatever the reason, Sophia made her choice. She responded in French, her accent carrying the subtle musicality of someone who had learned the language not in classrooms but in kitchens and markets, from her grandmother's patient instruction and years of practice. She repeated his order with exact precision, confirming the foie gras preparation and the specific Armagnac reduction he had mentioned. Then, without pause, she offered a wine pairing suggestion, recommending a sauternes from a particular chateau that would complement the sweetness of the fig compote while cutting through the richness of the liver. She spoke clearly but without ostentation, her tone professional, as though this were simply the natural course of the conversation. The change at the table was immediate and palpable. Marcus's expression, which had been arranged in anticipatory satisfaction, faltered. His eyebrows drew together slightly, and his posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. The woman stopped laughing mid-breath, her hand freezing on her glass, her eyes widening as she looked between Marcus and Sophia. The air around Table 7 seemed to compress, the easy superiority that had characterized their interaction suddenly punctured. Sophia maintained her composure, her notepad still poised, waiting to see if there were any modifications to the order. Marcus recovered quickly, though not quickly enough to hide the momentary displacement that had crossed his face. He nodded curtly, confirming the wine selection Sophia had suggested, though his voice had lost some of its earlier bravado. The woman looked down at her menu, her smile now fixed and uncertain, as though the script they had been following had suddenly revealed unexpected dialogue. Sophia thanked them in French, her voice even, and turned to leave, aware that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic of the evening. The change at the table was immediate and palpable. Marcus's expression, which had been arranged in anticipatory satisfaction, faltered. His eyebrows drew together slightly, and his posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. The woman stopped laughing mid-breath, her hand freezing on her glass, her eyes widening as she looked between Marcus and Sophia. The air around table 7 seemed to compress. The easy superiority that had characterized their interaction suddenly punctured. Sophia maintained her composure, her notepad still poised, waiting to see if there were any modifications to the order. Marcus recovered quickly, though not quickly enough to hide the momentary displacement that had crossed his face. He nodded curtly, confirming the wine selection Sophia had suggested, though his voice had lost some of its earlier bravado. The woman looked down at her menu, her smile now fixed and uncertain, as though the script they had been following had suddenly revealed unexpected dialogue. Sophia thanked them in French, her voice even, and turned to leave, aware that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic of the evening. As she walked back toward the kitchen, Sophia felt her heart beating faster than usual, a quickening that was part adrenaline and part something else she could not immediately name. Her hands, which had remained steady throughout the exchange, now trembled slightly as she pushed through the swinging door into the bright, chaotic warmth of the kitchen. The sounds here were louder, more honest. The sizzle of pans, the sharp commands of the head chef, the clattering of plates being arranged for service. She set down her notepad and took a slow breath, letting the familiar environment ground her. She had disrupted his script, that much was certain. What she did not yet know was whether that disruption would cost her or liberate her. The kitchen continued its rhythmic work around her, indifferent to the small revolution that had just occurred at table 7, and Sophia rejoined the flow, aware that the evening was far from over and that she had just crossed a threshold from which there might be no easy return. The appetizers emerged from the kitchen arranged with the meticulous artistry that La Lumière d'Or demanded of every plate. Sophia carried the tray with both hands, steadying it against her hip as she navigated between tables, her awareness heightened in a way that made every sound sharper, every glance more weighted. The foie gras glistened under the chandelier light, the fig compote dark and jewel-like beside it, and the delicate microgreens placed with tweezers formed a composition that was as much visual as culinary. She approached table 7 with the same professional bearing she had maintained throughout the evening, though she could feel the shift in atmosphere before she even reached them. Marcus watched her approach, his posture different now, more deliberate. The easy arrogance that had characterized his earlier demeanor had been replaced by something harder, more determined. His companion sat with her hands folded in her lap, her earlier animation subdued, and Sophia noticed the way her eyes flickered toward the other tables as though gauging whether anyone had witnessed the earlier exchange. Sophia set the plates down with careful precision, describing each element of the dish in English, her voice clear and unhurried. She was about to step back when Marcus began speaking again, this time in Italian. His words came quickly, laden with exaggerated emphasis on certain syllables, a performance designed to showcase his linguistic range while simultaneously testing hers. He gestured toward the foie gras and made a comment about its preparation, referencing a technique he claimed was specific to the Piedmont region, mispronouncing the name of the area with theatrical flourish. He then turned to his companion and translated his own statement into English, adding a small laugh that suggested he was sharing an inside joke at Sophia's expense. The woman smiled uncertainly, her discomfort now more visible, a tightness around her mouth that betrayed her awareness that this had moved beyond playful banter into something else. Sophia stood still, the empty tray held against her side. She recognized the game immediately, the escalation born not from curiosity or genuine interest but from wounded pride. Her grandmother had warned her about men like this, men who mistook their resources for intelligence and their privilege for virtue. Sophia could have remained silent, could have smiled politely and retreated, preserving the invisible boundary between server and served. But something in his tone, the mockery embedded in his mispronunciation, The assumption that she would not understand or would not dare to correct him sparked a quiet defiance she had been suppressing all evening. She responded in Italian, her accent carrying the rounded vowels of someone who had learned the language through immersion rather than textbooks. She thanked him for his observation but gently corrected his statement, noting that the technique he described actually originated from Emilia-Romagna, not Piedmont, and that the distinction mattered because the fat content of the liver was prepared differently depending on regional tradition. She spoke without condescension, simply offering information as she would to any guest seeking to understand what they were eating. Her words were measured, respectful, but unmistakably knowledgeable. The effect was immediate and more profound than the first exchange had been. Marcus's jaw tightened visibly, a muscle near his temple pulsing as he processed what had just occurred. His companion looked down at her plate, her fingers now gripping the edge of the table as though anchoring herself. Around them, the dining room's ambient conversation seemed to dip slightly, not into silence but into a collective awareness that something unusual was unfolding at table 7. A couple seated 2 tables away paused mid-conversation, their attention drawn by the shift in tone. An elderly woman dining alone glanced over her reading glasses, her expression curious but not unkind. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he regarded Sophia with an intensity that bordered on hostility. The pretense of amusement had evaporated entirely, replaced by something rawer and more revealing. He turned to his companion and spoke in a low voice, though loud enough for Sophia to hear, suggesting that perhaps they should request a different server, someone more suitable to their needs. The words were phrased as a question, but the command beneath them was clear. The woman hesitated, her eyes darting between Marcus and Sophia, and in that hesitation Sophia saw the discomfort of someone caught between loyalty and a dawning awareness that she was complicit in something unpleasant. Sophia felt her hands begin to tremble, a physical response she could not entirely control. She folded them in front of her, pressing her palms together briefly to still the shaking, then excused herself with quiet professionalism, explaining that she would inform the manager of their request. Her voice remained steady, but internally she felt a cascade of emotions she had spent years learning to suppress. Anger at the casual cruelty, anxiety about potential consequences for her employment, and beneath it all, a stubborn satisfaction that she had not allowed herself to be diminished without response. As she walked away from table 7, she was acutely aware of the eyes following her, not just from Marcus and his companion but from other diners who had sensed the tension and were now watching with varying degrees of interest. The dining room, which had felt like a stage earlier, now felt like a courtroom where judgment was being quietly rendered by an audience she had not chosen. Sophia pushed through the kitchen doors, the noise and heat enveloping her like a shield, and she allowed herself a single moment to close her eyes and breathe before facing whatever would come next. The kitchen was a world unto itself, operating by rhythms and hierarchies that existed outside the refined choreography of the dining room. Heat radiated from the industrial stoves where flames leaped beneath copper pans, and the air carried the layered scents of reduction sauces, searing meat, and fresh herbs being chopped with rapid precision. Sophia stood just inside the swinging doors, her back pressed briefly against the stainless steel counter, allowing herself a moment to absorb the controlled chaos that surrounded her. The noise here was honest and unfiltered. The sharp commands of the head chef, the sizzle and clang of cookware, the rhythmic thud of knives against cutting boards. It was a sanctuary of sorts, a place where pretense gave way to skill and effort. Chef Esteban noticed her immediately. He was a man in his late 60s, his face lined with the kind of creases that came from decades spent in front of open flames and under fluorescent lights. He had immigrated from Galicia more than 40 years ago, arriving with little more than a battered knife set and the recipes his mother had taught him. Over time, he had built a reputation that allowed him to command kitchens like this one, but he had never forgotten what it meant to be underestimated, to have your accent questioned or your competence doubted because of where you came from. He looked up from the duck he was plating, his dark eyes meeting Sophia's across the kitchen, and in that brief exchange something passed between them that required no words. He nodded once, a gesture of recognition and solidarity, before returning his attention to the intricate arrangement of vegetables on the plate before him. A younger line cook named Matteo, who had started working at La Lumière d'Or only 6 months earlier, leaned towards Sophia as she moved to check the orders waiting on the pass. He spoke quietly, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise, telling her that he had heard what happened, that the servers had been talking. He offered words of encouragement, simple and unpolished but genuine, reminding her that she had done nothing wrong, that Marcus Aldridge was known among the staff as someone who treated service workers with contempt. Matteo's own experiences with difficult patrons had left him with a particular sensitivity to these moments, and Sophia appreciated his attempt at comfort even as she felt the weight of what was still to come pressing down on her shoulders. Before she could respond, the manager appeared in the kitchen doorway. Richard Castellano was a man perpetually caught between competing demands: the need to maintain the restaurant's reputation, the pressure to keep wealthy patrons satisfied, and the responsibility he felt toward his staff, though that responsibility was often subordinated to the first two concerns. He was competent and generally fair, but Sophia knew that fairness had limits when confronted with money and influence. He approached her with a careful expression, his hands clasped in front of him in a posture that suggested both authority and unease. He asked to speak with her privately, and they moved to a small alcove near the walk-in refrigerator where the noise was slightly muted. Richard explained that he was aware of the situation at table 7, that Marcus had indeed requested a different server, and that this put him in a delicate position. He spoke in measured tones, emphasizing that Sophia had always been a valued member of the team, that her professionalism was not in question, but that sometimes discretion was the better part of valor. He advised her to remain calm, to avoid any further exchanges that might be interpreted as confrontational, and to remember that guests like Marcus Aldridge represented significant revenue for the restaurant. The subtext was clear: her dignity mattered, but not as much as the comfort of a paying customer. Sophia listened without interrupting, her face composed even as she felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She had heard variations of this speech before, in different contexts and from different authority figures, the implicit message always the same: know your place, do not make waves, accept indignity as the price of employment. She understood Richard's position, could even sympathize with the pressures he faced, but understanding did not erase the bitter taste that settled on her tongue. When he finished speaking, she nodded and thanked him for his guidance, her voice steady, offering no indication of the turmoil beneath her calm exterior. She returned to the main kitchen area, where Chef Esteban was now expediting orders, his voice cutting through the noise with practiced efficiency. He glanced at her again, and this time there was a question in his eyes. Sophia straightened her shoulders, adjusted her apron, and picked up the tray of entrees waiting to be delivered to another table. She made her choice in that moment, a quiet decision that required no grand gesture or declaration. She would continue serving, would maintain the grace and professionalism that had defined her work, but she would not shrink. She would not make herself smaller to accommodate someone else's need to feel superior. As she pushed back through the swinging doors into the dining room, the sounds of the kitchen faded behind her, replaced once more by the muted elegance of classical music and hushed conversation. She carried the tray with steady hands, her expression composed, and moved through the space with the same careful dignity she had brought to every shift. Her livelihood was indeed on the line, as was her sense of self, and she understood that the evening was far from over. But she also understood that some concessions, once made, could never be taken back, and she refused to be the kind of person who surrendered her dignity simply because it was expected. The dining room had settled into the comfortable rhythm of late evening service, that particular hour when appetites were satisfied and conversations turned more reflective, when wine glasses were refilled with less urgency and the pace of the meal slowed to accommodate lingering. Sophia had spent the intervening time attending to other tables, offering recommendations with practiced ease, refilling water glasses, ensuring that each guest felt attended to without being intruded upon. She had almost allowed herself to believe that the situation at table 7 might resolve itself quietly, that Marcus would finish his meal and depart, leaving behind nothing more than an uncomfortable memory. But she understood, even as she entertained this hope, that men like Marcus rarely allowed their pride to be wounded without seeking some form of recompense. When she returned to table 7 to present the dessert menu, the atmosphere had shifted again. Marcus sat with his spine rigid against the chair back, his expression set in a kind of determined resolve that suggested he had spent the past hour preparing for this moment. His companion looked tired now, her earlier enthusiasm completely extinguished, replaced by a wary resignation. She had stopped trying to engage him in conversation, instead focusing her attention on her phone, scrolling with the mechanical distraction of someone seeking escape. Sophia approached with the menus, extending them with the same courtesy she offered every guest, though she could feel the tension radiating from the table like heat from pavement after a summer rain. Marcus took the menu without looking at it, his gaze fixed instead on Sophia's face with an intensity that bordered on hostility. Then he began speaking in German, his voice pitched louder than necessary, the words crisp and deliberate. He asked about the dessert selection, but his tone carried none of the genuine curiosity of someone seeking information. Instead, each sentence felt like a challenge, a verbal gauntlet thrown down with the expectation that she would stumble. He emphasized particular words with exaggerated pronunciation, speaking clearly enough that the tables surrounding them could hear, transforming what should have been a private exchange into a public performance. The nearby diners began to take notice. A couple seated to the left paused their conversation, the woman's fork suspended halfway to her mouth as she glanced toward table 7. At the table directly behind Marcus, an older gentleman with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses lowered his newspaper slightly, his attention drawn by the unusual volume and tone. The room's ambient sound seemed to contract around them, creating a pocket of heightened awareness where every word carried additional weight. Sophia felt the collective attention like a physical pressure, the scrutiny of strangers becoming an invisible audience to whatever would unfold next. She responded in German, her voice calm and measured, matching his volume without exceeding it. She described the Schwarzwälder Kirschtorte on the menu, explaining its traditional preparation and the specific Kirsch used in the cherry compote. She noted that the dessert originated in the Black Forest region and had been adapted here to include a layer of dark chocolate ganache that complemented the tartness of the fruit. Then, without pause, she suggested a digestif, recommending a particular Obstler that would cleanse the palate while echoing the fruit notes in the dessert. Her German carried the slight formality of textbook learning refined through practice, clear and grammatically precise. Marcus's reaction was immediate and volcanic. His hand came down on the table with enough force to rattle the silverware and send a tremor through the wine glasses. The sharp sound cut through the dining room like a thunderclap, causing heads to turn throughout the space. His companion flinched visibly, her body jerking back in her chair, her eyes widening with a mixture of alarm and embarrassment. The woman at the adjacent table gasped softly, her hand moving instinctively to her chest, while her partner leaned forward slightly, as though preparing to intervene should the situation escalate further. Marcus pushed his chair back with a scraping sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden hush that had fallen over the room. His face had flushed with anger, the color rising from his collar to his cheeks, and when he spoke again his voice carried across the dining room with unmistakable fury. He demanded to speak to the manager, his words sharp and clipped, each syllable enunciated with the kind of precision that comes from someone accustomed to having their demands met immediately. He stood now, his full height emphasizing the power differential he was attempting to reassert, and pointed toward Sophia as though she were evidence in a case he was building. Sophia remained still, her hands folded in front of her, her expression composed despite the anxiety that constricted her chest like a tightening band. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, could sense the eyes of every patron in the room fixed upon her, judging, questioning, wondering what had transpired to provoke such a reaction. The older gentleman with the newspaper had set it down entirely now, his gaze moving between Marcus and Sophia with an analytical attention that suggested he was assessing not just the surface disturbance but the currents running beneath it. The moment stretched, suspended in a kind of terrible clarity where every detail seemed amplified. The chandelier light catching the fury in Marcus's eyes, the quiet distress on his companion's face, the collective held breath of the dining room. Sophia understood that she had reached a point of no return, that whatever came next would define not just this evening but potentially her future at La Lumière d'Or. Yet she refused to apologize for answering a question, refused to diminish herself simply because her competence had offended someone's vanity. She stood in that charged silence, her dignity intact even as uncertainty churned within her, waiting for the manager to arrive and render whatever judgment awaited her. Richard Castellano emerged from the kitchen with the measured stride of someone who had been summoned to crisis many times before, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed his awareness that this situation carried particular weight. He moved through the dining room with his professional smile fixed in place, acknowledging guests with brief nods even as his attention remained focused on table 7, where Marcus stood like a prosecutor awaiting judgment. The ambient conversations had not resumed their previous volume. Instead, the room maintained a hushed quality, the kind of collective attention that transforms a restaurant into a theater where diners become unwilling spectators to drama they had not paid to witness. Richard arrived at the table and immediately adopted the posture of diplomatic mediation, his hands open and visible, his expression arranged in an approximation of concerned neutrality. He greeted Marcus by name, acknowledging his status as a valued patron, and asked in a voice carefully modulated to convey both respect and authority what seemed to be the difficulty. Marcus wasted no time. He launched into his complaint with the force of accumulated grievances, gesturing toward Sophia as he spoke, his words tumbling out in a mixture of indignation and entitlement. He accused her of insubordination, of deliberately contradicting him, of displaying an attitude unbefitting her position. He demanded, with the certainty of someone accustomed to having demands met, that she be removed from his table immediately and that someone more appropriate take over his service. Sophia stood several feet away, her posture straight but not defiant, her hands folded at her waist. She watched the exchange with the careful stillness of someone who understands that any movement might be interpreted as evidence against her. Richard listened to Marcus's complaints with practiced attention, nodding at appropriate intervals, his face revealing nothing of whatever calculations were occurring behind his eyes. When Marcus finished, Richard turned to Sophia and asked, in a tone that attempted kindness but carried the weight of inevitability, if she would step aside so that he could reassign the table. It was phrased as a request, but both of them understood it as an instruction. Sophia complied without protest. She had known, from the moment Richard appeared, that this was how it would unfold. The architecture of power in places like La Lumière d'Or was never in doubt. Wealth determined outcomes, and her role was to absorb indignity with grace. She moved toward the service station near the kitchen doors, removing herself from Marcus's immediate presence, though she remained within sight of the table. Her face betrayed no emotion, but internally she felt the familiar hollow ache of being diminished, of watching her dignity measured against someone else's comfort and found wanting. She had expected this, had prepared herself for it, yet expectation did not soften the impact. Marcus settled back into his chair, his expression shifting into something that resembled satisfaction. The smirk that crossed his face was brief but unmistakable, a small curve of lips that communicated triumph. He had reasserted the natural order, reminded everyone present of how these situations were meant to resolve. His companion, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, picked up her water glass with shaking hands, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth as though she might find escape in the white linen. Richard began to speak, likely preparing to offer some form of compensation or appeasement, when movement from a nearby table interrupted him. The older gentleman who had been watching the entire exchange with quiet attention rose from his seat. He moved with the deliberate grace of someone whose age had not diminished his presence, his silver hair catching the light, his wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the chandeliers above. He approached table 7 without hurry, and something in his bearing caused the room's attention to shift toward him. Richard paused mid-sentence, recognizing the man, and his expression changed subtly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his carefully maintained neutrality. The gentleman introduced himself, speaking clearly enough that nearby tables could hear, identifying himself as Dr. William Harrington, a regular patron of the restaurant for the past 15 years and a retired diplomat who had served in various European postings throughout his career. He stated, with the kind of calm authority that requires neither volume nor aggression, that he had witnessed the entire exchange between Marcus and Sophia from his table. He explained that he had been dining alone and had therefore had the opportunity to observe without distraction. He noted that the young woman had conducted herself with exemplary professionalism throughout, responding to questions posed to her in multiple languages with courtesy and accuracy. He emphasized that at no point had she displayed insubordination or inappropriate behavior, but had simply performed her duties with competence. His words were measured and precise, each sentence constructed with the care of someone who understood the power of language to shape perception. The silence that fell over the dining room was different now, heavier and more expectant. Other diners who had been pretending not to watch abandoned the pretense entirely, turning in their seats to observe. Marcus's expression shifted from satisfaction to confusion to the beginnings of defensive anger, his jaw tightening as he processed this unexpected intervention. His companion looked up at Dr. Harrington with something that might have been relief or perhaps recognition that the narrative had shifted in ways she had not anticipated. Richard stood frozen between the two men, his diplomatic smile finally cracking to reveal genuine uncertainty. Dr. Harrington did not wait for a response. He simply stated that he felt it important, as a witness to the events, to offer his perspective, and that he hoped the matter would be resolved with fairness to all parties involved. Then he returned to his table with the same unhurried dignity with which he had approached, leaving behind a silence that demanded some form of reckoning. Richard looked from Marcus to Sophia to the now-seated diplomat, his expression revealing the genuine dilemma of a man caught between competing pressures, suddenly aware that the simple calculation he had been prepared to make had become far more complex than anticipated. Dr. Harrington did not sit down immediately upon returning to his table. Instead, he remained standing, his hand resting lightly on the back of his chair. And in that posture there was an invitation for continued engagement that Richard recognized with the instinct of someone trained to read social cues. The manager glanced between Marcus, whose expression had darkened considerably, and the diplomat, whose calm demeanor suggested he had not yet finished what he intended to say. The dining room remained suspended in that peculiar state of collective attention. Conversations abandoned, forks set down, the only sounds the muted clinking from the kitchen and the soft mechanical hum of the ventilation system. Dr. Harrington began speaking again, his voice carrying the same measured authority but now directed specifically at Richard rather than the room at large. He explained that he felt compelled to offer additional context, given the seriousness of the accusations that had been leveled. He recounted what he had observed over the course of the evening, describing the sequence of events with the precision of someone whose professional life had required careful attention to detail and nuance. He noted that the young woman, whom he had since learned was named Sophia, had approached the table multiple times with consistent professionalism, that she had been addressed in what he counted as at least 3 different languages, and that in each instance she had responded with both linguistic competence and appropriate service behavior. He then offered an observation that shifted the tenor of the conversation entirely. Speaking with the casual expertise of someone who had spent decades navigating international contexts, he remarked that he had noticed Marcus's French carried the refined accent of Parisian education, likely acquired through study at a prestigious institution, while his Italian was competent but structured, suggesting formal instruction rather than organic acquisition. The German, however, had been what Dr. Harrington described as textbook, technically accurate but lacking the regional variations and colloquialisms that marked a native speaker or someone who had spent significant time immersed in German-speaking communities. He offered these observations not as criticism but as neutral assessment, the kind of linguistic analysis that was second nature to someone who had built a career on understanding how language revealed origin, education, and sometimes intention. Marcus's face, which had already been flushed with anger, now deepened to a shade that suggested both rage and humiliation. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening, and his breathing had become audibly heavier. His companion shifted in her seat, her discomfort now impossible to disguise, her eyes darting toward the exit as though calculating the social cost of leaving versus staying. The other diners watched with varying degrees of fascination and discomfort, some leaning forward slightly, others averting their gazes as though they might somehow unhear what was unfolding. Dr. Harrington then did something unexpected. He turned his attention directly to Sophia, who had remained near the service station, and addressed her in Mandarin. The question was simple, inquiring about her background and how she had come to learn so many languages. The shift to yet another language rippled through the room like a wave, and for a moment Sophia hesitated, her surprise visible in the slight widening of her eyes. Then she responded, her Mandarin fluent and natural, explaining in brief sentences about her grandmother who had been a translator and had raised her in a multilingual household where language was treated not as luxury, but as necessary skill for navigating a world that often made assumptions based on appearance and accent. The diplomat smiled, a genuine expression of approval and recognition. He thanked her in Mandarin, then switched back to English to address the room at large, noting that true linguistic ability, the kind that came from necessity and lived experience rather than academic achievement, carried a different quality, a fluidity that could not be entirely replicated through formal study alone. The implication was clear without being explicitly stated. Sophia's competence was born from something deeper than the performance Marcus had attempted, and the contrast between them was not merely one of social position but of authentic capability versus affected sophistication. Marcus's companion chose that moment to stand abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that broke the spell of collective attention. She excused herself in a voice barely above a whisper, murmuring something about the restroom, and fled toward the back of the dining room with hurried steps that suggested escape rather than necessity. Her departure left Marcus sitting alone at table 7, isolated in a way that went beyond physical solitude, exposed now not just as someone who had mistreated service staff but as someone whose entire performance had been dismantled by a witness he had not anticipated and could not intimidate. The balance of power in the room had shifted with such completeness that even the ambient sounds seemed different, as though the space itself had recalibrated around a new understanding. Richard stood uncertain, his carefully maintained neutrality inadequate to the complexity of what had just occurred. He turned to Dr. Harrington and thanked him formally for his perspective, his tone carrying a deference that had been absent from his earlier interactions. Then he turned to Marcus, and when he spoke again his voice had lost its placating edge, replaced by something more measured and professional, the tone of someone addressing an equal rather than a superior. He suggested, with careful diplomacy, that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding, that emotions had run high, and that it might be best to allow everyone to proceed with their evening without further disruption. The words were framed as conciliation, but the subtext was unmistakable. The situation had been witnessed and judged, and the judgment had not fallen in Marcus's favor. Sophia remained where she stood, her expression still composed but her eyes reflecting a mixture of disbelief and cautious relief, aware that something had changed but uncertain yet what that change would mean for her. The dining room began slowly to resume its normal rhythms, conversations restarting in hushed tones, though the echo of what had transpired would linger long after the last plate was cleared. The minutes following Dr. Harrington's intervention passed with a peculiar quality, as though time itself had slowed to accommodate the weight of what had transpired. Marcus remained seated at table 7, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on some indeterminate point in the middle distance. The dining room gradually resumed its normal operations, conversations restarting in cautious murmurs, silverware clinking against porcelain with renewed purpose. But the atmosphere had been fundamentally altered. There was a new awareness among the patrons, a collective consciousness that they had witnessed something significant, and this awareness colored every subsequent interaction with a kind of heightened sensitivity. Sophia had been quietly reassigned by Richard, who approached her with an expression that contained both apology and relief. He asked her to attend to tables on the opposite side of the dining room, away from Marcus, and she accepted this reallocation without comment, grateful for the physical distance even as she remained acutely aware of table 7 in her peripheral vision. As she moved through her new section, refilling wine glasses and clearing plates with the same practiced efficiency she had maintained all evening, she noticed something unexpected. The guests at her tables were treating her differently. Not with pity, which she would have found unbearable, but with a kind of respectful acknowledgement, as though she had passed some unspoken test. A woman dining with her husband at table 12 caught Sophia's eye as she approached to clear their appetizer plates. The woman was perhaps in her late 50s, elegantly dressed in a navy blazer, her hair styled in a neat silver bob. She waited until Sophia had set down the plates she was carrying, then spoke in a low voice, thanking her for her grace under pressure. The words were simple but delivered with genuine warmth, and Sophia felt an unexpected tightness in her throat. The emotional control she had maintained all evening suddenly precarious in the face of kindness. She thanked the woman quietly and continued with her work, but the exchange stayed with her, a small counterweight to the humiliation she had endured. Meanwhile, at table 7, Marcus sat alone. His companion had not returned from the restroom, and as the minutes stretched into a quarter hour, it became increasingly clear that she was not going to. A junior waiter named Thomas, tasked with monitoring the situation, had discreetly checked the restroom area and then the coat check, where he discovered that the woman's belongings were no longer hanging on their designated hook. He reported this to Richard, who absorbed the information with a slight tightening around his eyes, recognizing the social catastrophe this represented for Marcus. Thomas was then sent to deliver the news, a task he approached with visible reluctance. The young waiter leaned close to Marcus and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, informing him that his companion had apparently departed through the side exit that led to the street. Marcus received this information without visible reaction, though his jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. He dismissed Thomas with a curt nod, then sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the empty chair across from him. The performance that had defined his evening, the carefully orchestrated display of sophistication and superiority, had collapsed entirely. He was no longer the leading actor in his own production but rather a man sitting alone in a restaurant, abandoned by his date, observed by strangers who had witnessed his cruelty and found it wanting. He signaled for a waiter, and when one approached, he ordered a scotch, speaking in plain English with none of the linguistic flourishes that had characterized his earlier interactions. His voice was flat, depleted of its former arrogance, and the waiter accepted the order with professional efficiency, betraying no judgment though the entire staff was by now aware of what had occurred. Marcus sat alone with his drink when it arrived, occasionally lifting it to his lips but seeming to take little satisfaction from it. The meal he had ordered earlier was brought to him, the duck confit plated with the same meticulous care that characterized every dish at La Lumière d'Or, but he ate mechanically, without apparent enjoyment, a man going through motions because the alternative was to acknowledge the complete dissolution of his evening. Sophia continued her work across the room, and as the evening progressed, another unexpected moment occurred. The woman in the navy blazer, who Sophia learned was named Dr. Patricia Morrison, requested her specifically as she was preparing to leave. Dr. Morrison explained that she was a professor of linguistics at the university and that she had been deeply impressed by what she had witnessed. She reached into her purse and withdrew a business card, pressing it into Sophia's hand with quiet insistence. She encouraged Sophia to contact her about the university's translation and interpretation program, suggesting that someone with her natural abilities and evident composure would be an excellent candidate. Sophia accepted the card with genuine surprise, holding it carefully as though it might dissolve if handled too roughly, and thanked Dr. Morrison with words that felt inadequate to express her gratitude. The evening wound toward its conclusion, the dining room gradually emptying as satisfied patrons settled their bills and departed into the night. Marcus finished his meal in continued silence, eventually requesting his check with the same flat effect that had characterized his demeanor since his companion's departure. He paid without comment, leaving a tip that was neither generous nor insulting, simply adequate, and departed through the main entrance without looking back. Sophia watched him go from her position near the service station, feeling not triumph but a complex mixture of relief and exhaustion, aware that the evening had extracted a cost from everyone involved, herself included, and that the resolution, such as it was, felt less like victory than survival. The last patrons departed just after 11, leaving behind the familiar debris of a successful service. Wine-stained tablecloths bundled for laundry, crumpled napkins, the faint residue of perfume and cologne lingering in the air. The dining room, so carefully staged for elegance only hours before, now revealed its true nature as a workspace, the illusion of effortless refinement giving way to the practical reality of chairs stacked on tables and floors being swept. Sophia had remained on the floor longer than necessary, finding small tasks to occupy her hands while her mind processed the extraordinary events of the evening. She refolded napkins that didn't need refolding, straightened silverware that was already aligned, delaying the moment when she would have to stop moving and allow herself to feel the full weight of what had occurred. Richard found her near the service station and suggested, with unusual gentleness, that she join the rest of the staff in the kitchen. It was tradition after particularly difficult or successful nights to gather briefly before everyone dispersed to their separate lives. A moment of collective decompression that acknowledged the intensity of work that required both physical stamina and emotional labor. Sophia followed him through the swinging doors into the bright fluorescent reality of the kitchen, where the industrial equipment was being cleaned and the stainless steel surfaces gleamed under the harsh overhead lights. Chef Esteban stood at the prep counter with a bottle of red wine, one of the house selections that would never be inventoried or missed. He was pulling the cork as Sophia entered, and the soft pop seemed to signal a shift from professional mode to something more human and communal. He began pouring the wine into an assortment of mismatched glasses, the small tumblers typically used for staff water, and distributed them among the assembled group. The line cooks, the dishwashers, the other servers, all gathered in a loose semicircle, their faces showing the particular exhaustion that comes from sustained performance under pressure. What surprised Sophia was the presence of Dr. Harrington, who stood somewhat apart from the staff but had clearly been invited into this private space. Richard had extended the invitation, a gesture that acknowledged the diplomat's role in the evening's events and perhaps sought to repair, through inclusion, the damage that had been done by his initial hesitation. Dr. Harrington held his glass with both hands, looking slightly out of place in his formal attire among the staff in their work clothes and aprons, but his expression was warm and his posture relaxed, suggesting he understood the honor being extended to him. Esteban raised his glass in a simple toast, speaking in his accented English about dignity and standing firm, words that carried particular weight coming from a man who had spent his life navigating spaces where his value was often questioned. The group drank, and the wine was ordinary but tasted extraordinary in that moment, a shared sacrament that marked the end of something difficult and the beginning of something not yet defined. Sophia drank slowly, feeling the warmth spread through her chest, and for the first time all evening she felt the tight control she had maintained begin to loosen. Dr. Harrington approached her as the others began to disperse into smaller conversations. He asked, with genuine curiosity rather than mere politeness, about her background and how she had come to speak so many languages with such fluency. Sophia found herself explaining about her grandmother. The woman who had raised her after her parents returned to their home country had become permanent rather than temporary. She described how her grandmother had worked as an informal translator in immigrant communities, helping people navigate bureaucracies and medical systems and legal documents, how language had been not a hobby or academic interest but a matter of survival and service. She spoke about the kitchen table lessons, the insistence on pronunciation, the quiet drilling of vocabulary in the evenings, and the underlying message that the world would not always be kind but that competence could create small pockets of safety. Dr. Harrington listened with the attention of someone accustomed to hearing beneath the surface of words, and when Sophia finished, he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a leather card holder. He selected a card and offered it to her, explaining that it contained his personal contact information as well as details for a professional network he had maintained throughout his career, a group of translators and interpreters who worked in diplomatic and international contexts. He suggested that someone with her abilities should not remain in service work unless she chose to, that there were paths available if she was interested in exploring them. His tone carried no condescension, simply a recognition of talent and an offer to facilitate its development. Sophia accepted the card with hands that trembled slightly, overwhelmed by the accumulation of kindness following so closely on the heels of humiliation. She thanked him with words that felt inadequate, and he simply nodded, understanding that sometimes gratitude could not be fully articulated. Richard approached then, and the diplomat excused himself, preparing to leave. The manager waited until Dr. Harrington had departed before turning to Sophia, and in his face she saw something she had not expected: genuine contrition. He apologized for his earlier hesitation, explaining without making excuses that he had been caught between competing pressures and had initially chosen the path of least resistance rather than the path of principle. Sophia accepted his apology with a nod, recognizing that Richard was not a villain but simply a man with constraints she understood better than he might realize. She told him she appreciated his honesty, and something in her tone released him from the burden of his guilt. The kitchen was nearly empty now, the others having drifted away to change and leave, and Sophia excused herself to do the same. She walked to the small staff changing area, removed her uniform with movements that felt slow and dreamlike, and dressed in her street clothes. As she gathered her belongings, she felt exhausted but strangely lighter, as though something heavy she had been carrying without realizing it had finally been set down. The days following that extraordinary evening unfolded with a rhythm that felt both familiar and subtly transformed, as though Sophia were walking through a landscape she had traversed countless times before but now seeing it under different light. She returned to work the next day with a mixture of apprehension and resolve, uncertain how the events would be remembered or discussed, whether she would face resentment from colleagues who might view her as having disrupted the delicate social equilibrium of the restaurant, or judgment from management for having been involved in a public disturbance regardless of fault. But what she encountered instead was something unexpected. A quiet solidarity among the staff and a shift in how she was perceived by the regular patrons who frequented La Lumière d'Or. The first message arrived 2 days later, forwarded through the restaurant's general inquiry email. It was from Dr. Patricia Morrison, the linguistics professor who had given Sophia her card. The email was warm and direct, reiterating her invitation and providing specific information about auditing an advanced linguistics course that would begin the following month. Dr. Morrison explained that the class focused on sociolinguistics and language acquisition in multilingual contexts, and she believed Sophia's lived experience would provide valuable perspective that purely academic students often lacked. She emphasized that there would be no tuition cost for auditing and that Sophia could participate as much or as little as her schedule allowed. The invitation was generous without being condescending, framed as an opportunity rather than charity, and Sophia read the message 3 times before responding with cautious acceptance. Another message came the following day, this time from a journalist who worked for a local culture and lifestyle magazine. The journalist explained that she had been dining at La Lumière d'Or the night of the incident and had found the exchange compelling. She wanted to write a feature article about multilingualism in service industries, exploring how language skills were often undervalued and how workers like Sophia navigated spaces where their competence was simultaneously essential and invisible. She requested an interview, offering to keep Sophia's full name anonymous if preferred, and promised a thoughtful exploration rather than sensationalist coverage. Sophia sat with this request for an entire evening, turning it over in her mind while she prepared dinner in the small apartment she shared with 2 other young women who also worked in hospitality. The idea of being interviewed, of having her experience examined and interpreted through someone else's lens, made her deeply uncomfortable. She had spent most of her life cultivating a kind of protective invisibility, moving through spaces without drawing undue attention, and the prospect of deliberately stepping into visibility felt dangerous in ways she could not fully articulate. She drafted and redrafted her response several times before finally sending a polite decline, thanking the journalist for her interest but explaining that she preferred to keep her private life separate from her work. At the restaurant itself, something remarkable began to happen. Regular patrons who had been present that evening, as well as others who had apparently heard about the incident through the informal networks that existed among the city's dining elite, began requesting Sophia by name when they made reservations. Richard noticed this trend within the first week, his practiced eye for patterns recognizing that Sophia had somehow become a draw rather than simply interchangeable staff. Guests would mention casually to the hostess that they hoped Sophia would be working, or they would ask to be seated in her section specifically, and when she served them they treated her with a particular kind of respectful attention that went beyond the usual courtesy extended to good service. One elderly couple who dined at La Lumière d'Or every Friday evening made a point of complimenting her not just on her service but on her composure and dignity, words that carried weight because they were spoken with genuine admiration rather than performative sympathy. A businessman who regularly entertained clients at the restaurant left a note with his payment, expressing appreciation for staff who brought excellence to their work, regardless of how they were treated. These small acknowledgments accumulated, creating a subtle shift in Sophia's experience of her workplace, as though she had been granted a measure of recognition that had previously been withheld. Richard called her into his office at the end of her shift one evening, nearly 2 weeks after the incident. She entered with familiar anxiety, conditioned by experience to associate such summons with criticism or bad news, but what he offered instead was unexpected. He explained that given the increased requests for her service and her consistent professionalism, He wanted to offer her additional shifts and a modest raise, approximately 12% above her current hourly wage. He framed it as recognition of her value to the restaurant, and while Sophia understood that this was also motivated by the pragmatic reality that she was generating goodwill among valuable patrons, she accepted the offer with genuine gratitude. As she walked home that evening, taking the long route through streets that were beginning to show the first signs of autumn, Sophia felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time: cautious hope. She understood that one evening, however extraordinary, did not fundamentally alter the structures that governed her life or the lives of people like her. She knew that the kindness of strangers, while meaningful, was not the same as systemic change. But she also recognized that something had shifted, that a door had opened slightly, and that she had been given resources and opportunities that had not existed for her before. She held Dr. Morrison's course information in her bag, felt the weight of the additional income in her future planning, and allowed herself to imagine, just briefly, that the trajectory of her life might bend towards something different than she had previously thought possible. The weeks had passed with the steady accumulation of small changes, and Sophia had settled into a new rhythm that included her shifts at La Lumière d'Or and her Tuesday evening audits of Dr. Morrison's linguistics course. She was beginning to understand that the night with Marcus had marked a dividing line in her life, separating what came before from what might come after, though she remained cautious about investing too much hope in this distinction. She had learned early that life rarely moved in straight lines and that progress could be reversed by circumstances beyond her control. Still, there was an undeniable difference in how she moved through the world now, a subtle shift in her internal compass that she was only beginning to recognize. It was a Thursday evening in late autumn when Marcus returned. Sophia was setting up her section for the dinner service, arranging silverware with the automatic precision that came from repetition, when she glanced toward the entrance and saw him being greeted by Carla at the host's stand. Her hands paused mid-motion, a fork suspended above the table, and she felt her heart rate accelerate with the instinctive response of someone encountering a source of past trauma. He was alone this time, dressed in a different suit but with the same careful grooming that suggested wealth and status. He did not look around the dining room as he followed Carla to his table, and Sophia noticed that his posture lacked the confident swagger that had characterized his previous visit. By coincidence or perhaps some unconscious decision on Richard's part, Marcus was seated in Sophia's section. She learned this when the manager approached her near the kitchen and informed her of the assignment, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes searching her face for reaction. He offered to reassign the table if she preferred, phrasing it as consideration for her comfort rather than doubt about her professionalism. Sophia considered the offer briefly, weighing the appeal of avoidance against something else she could not quite name, a sense that unfinished business required completion. She told Richard she would serve the table, and he nodded, accepting her decision without further comment. Sophia took a moment in the small alcove near the kitchen, straightening her apron and checking her reflection in the polished surface of a serving tray. She looked the same as always, composed and professional, but she felt different inside, less afraid of being diminished by this encounter. She gathered menus and the wine list, then walked across the dining room to Marcus's table with steady steps. He looked up as she approached, and something in his expression suggested he had recognized her immediately, had perhaps known she worked this section and had accepted the table anyway. She greeted him with the same professional courtesy she extended to every guest, offering water and presenting the menu without reference to their previous encounter. He accepted both with a quiet thank you, his voice lacking the performative quality she remembered. When he ordered, he spoke in English, choosing his selections simply and directly, without the elaborate culinary terminology or linguistic display that had characterized their last interaction. His demeanor was subdued, almost withdrawn, and Sophia found herself observing him with a kind of detached curiosity, wondering what had transpired in the intervening weeks to produce this change. She brought his appetizer with the same careful attention she gave to all her tables, setting the plate before him with practiced precision. As she was about to step back, Marcus spoke, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond their immediate space. He said that he wanted to acknowledge that his behavior during his previous visit had been inappropriate, that he had acted poorly and that she had not deserved to be treated that way. The words came out stiffly, as though he had rehearsed them but remained uncomfortable with their delivery. He did not ask for forgiveness, did not offer explanations or excuses, simply stated the acknowledgement and then fell silent, looking down at his plate rather than meeting her eyes. Sophia stood still for a moment, absorbing the apology that was and was not an apology, recognizing it as something partial and imperfect but perhaps genuine within its limitations. She nodded, a single inclination of her head that served as acceptance without requiring her to offer absolution or make him feel better about what he had done. She told him to enjoy his meal and return to her other duties, aware that something had shifted again but uncertain of its significance. Throughout the rest of his meal, she served him with attentive professionalism, neither warm nor cold, simply present in the way good service required. He ate quietly, occasionally glancing around the dining room but mostly keeping his attention on his food. When he requested his check, he thanked her in the same subdued tone he had maintained all evening, and when she returned with the payment folder, she found that he had left a tip that was notably generous, perhaps 40% above the standard expectation. There was no note, no further comment, just the money left on the table as a gesture that could be interpreted multiple ways. Sophia watched him leave, his figure disappearing through the front entrance into the evening beyond, and she felt an unexpected sense of closure. There was no triumph in this moment, no vindication or satisfaction at having received an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Neither was there lingering resentment or anger. What she felt instead was something quieter and more complex, a recognition that people were capable of both cruelty and growth, and that sometimes the best resolution was not dramatic but simply the quiet acceptance that harm had been done, acknowledged, and could now be set aside. She cleared his table with the same efficiency she brought to all her work, and then moved on to serve the next guests who needed her attention. The university campus in the early evening carried a different energy than it did during the day, quieter and more contemplative, populated by working adults who arrived in professional clothes with notebooks tucked under their arms and the particular tiredness that came from balancing multiple responsibilities. Sophia joined this population on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, walking through the old brick buildings with their tall windows and worn stone steps, feeling both out of place and strangely at home. Dr. Morrison's linguistics course met in a seminar room on the third floor of the Humanities building, a space with mismatched chairs arranged in a circle and a chalkboard that still bore the ghostly traces of previous lessons imperfectly erased. The other students were a mix of graduate candidates pursuing formal degrees and a few auditors like herself, people drawn to the subject by personal history rather than career requirements. There was a middle-aged woman who had grown up speaking Tagalog and English and was now exploring theories of code switching, a younger man whose parents were deaf and who was interested in the intersection of spoken and sign languages, and an elderly gentleman who had taught English as a second language for decades and was now studying the pedagogical frameworks he had intuitively practiced. Sophia found herself contributing more than she had anticipated, her observations about language as survival tool rather than academic abstraction adding a dimension to discussions that purely theoretical approaches sometimes missed. She continued working at La Lumière d'Or, but the restaurant had shifted in her internal landscape from being the entirety of her professional identity to becoming one element among several. She still took pride in her work, still moved through the dining room with the same careful attention to detail, but there was a difference in how she held herself now, a sense that this was not the full measure of who she was or could become. Her colleagues noticed the change, though most could not articulate exactly what had shifted. Matteo commented once that she seemed lighter, less burdened, and Sophia had smiled at the observation because it felt accurate even if she could not entirely explain why. One Saturday afternoon, during the quiet hours between lunch and dinner service when the staff gathered in the kitchen for family meal, Sophia told them about the university classes and her plans to eventually pursue certification in interpretation work. Chef Esteban, who was ladling pasta into bowls with the same care he brought to plating dishes for paying guests, paused and looked at her with an expression that combined pride and theatrical sorrow. He teased her about abandoning them, about leaving him to train yet another server who would not understand the difference between al dente and overcooked, but his eyes were warm and his voice carried genuine affection. He told her that she was too good for this work anyway, that she had always been too good, and that he was happy she was finally recognizing it herself. Sophia visited her grandmother every Sunday, taking the bus across the city to the modest apartment where the old woman lived with Sophia's cousin and his young family. Her grandmother was in her 80s now, her body diminished by age but her mind still sharp, still switching effortlessly between the 6 languages she had carried through her long life. They sat together in the small living room with its mismatched furniture and photographs covering every available surface, and Sophia described the classes, the texts they were reading, the theories about language acquisition and social-linguistic identity. Her grandmother listened with the intensity of someone who had lived these theories without needing academic vocabulary to name them, occasionally interjecting observations that cut to the heart of complex ideas with the efficiency of earned wisdom. When Sophia explained her plans to pursue interpretation work, possibly in legal or medical contexts where accurate translation could mean the difference between justice and injustice, care and neglect, her grandmother reached across the space between them and took her hand. The old woman's grip was still strong despite the arthritis that had gnarled her fingers, and she told Sophia that this was what language was meant for, not performance or display but service and bridge building. She said that Sophia had always understood this instinctively, had always known that words were tools that could either build walls or open doors, and that she was proud to see her granddaughter choosing to open doors for others the way she herself had tried to do throughout her life. Dr. Harrington had become an occasional presence in Sophia's life, meeting her for coffee every few weeks to discuss her progress and offer guidance about professional networks and certification requirements. He never presumed to direct her choices or impose expectations, instead offering information and connections that she could accept or decline according to her own judgment. He introduced her via email to a colleague who worked with the United Nations Translation Services, and to another who specialized in medical interpretation. These connections existed as possibilities rather than obligations, pathways that Sophia could explore when and if she felt ready. As winter approached and the year moved toward its close, Sophia found herself standing at what she recognized as a threshold. She was not naive enough to believe that one confrontation had fundamentally altered her circumstances or that the path ahead would be easy. She understood that systemic inequalities did not dissolve because one person had been treated fairly, that she would continue to encounter assumptions and prejudices based on her appearance and background. But she had learned something essential during that extraordinary evening and in the weeks that followed, that respect was not given by those who demanded it loudest or who possessed the most wealth or status, but was earned by those who held themselves with quiet certainty, who refused to shrink or diminish themselves to accommodate someone else's need for superiority. She carried this understanding with her as she moved between the restaurant and the university, between the practical demands of earning a living and the longer-term work of building a different future. She had been shaped not by a single moment of confrontation but by the steady accumulation of small dignities, by the grandmother who had taught her that language was power, by the chef who had recognized her worth, by the diplomat who had witnessed her grace under pressure and offered her a hand forward. She stood at the edge of a new chapter, uncertain of exactly where it would lead but no longer afraid to step into it, trusting that the same qualities that had sustained her through difficulty would guide her through whatever came next.